Welcome. This is one of over 200 talks on the history of Western art, and I've arranged the talks chronologically, starting with cave art through to art produced in the last few years. There's something, I think, for everyone here, so feel free to start wherever you like. This particular section is section 12 on Tudor and Stuart art, and this talk is on Hans Holbein the Younger, his life, particularly in England, and the well-known personalities of Henry VIII's court that he painted. Hans Holbein the Younger. He was a German artist and printmaker. He worked in the Northern European Renaissance style, and his father, Hans Holbein the Elder, was a German painter from Augsburg, Bavaria, and a member of a family of painters. Holbein the Younger was a goldsmith who became one of the great portrait painters of the 16th century. Like his father, he was born in Augsburg, but moved and worked mainly in Basel as a young artist. He came to England in 1526 when he was 29 to better his fortunes. He worked in England for 2 years, came back 4 years later, stayed until his death in 1543. The reason he came for only 2 years initially was that the regulations of his Painters' Guild in Basel meant he could only leave for 2 years and mustn't work for a foreign court. So when he returned to Basel, he found there was violent iconoclasm, and it made his life as a painter difficult. So he returned to England, as I said, 4 years later, despite the protestations of the Basel Town Council. On his second visit, he worked for Henry, was paid £30 a year. He made silverware, cups, designed fountains, jewellery, and even daggers, as well as the Whitehall mural and portraits of Henry and the royal family and courtiers. He produced portraits, in fact, of everyone from the grandest nobles to humble servants, and there are still 85 portrait drawings in the royal collection, of which about 30 can be connected with paintings. It's likely that the remainder of the paintings are now lost. When he was in England the second time, he did briefly return to Basel in 1538 because his wife and family lived there. And by that time he was a wealthy man, and we believe he provided for them as his wife was wealthy when she died. And then a final point is that shortly before he died, there were new laws introduced in England that forced foreign workers to become English citizens, which he did in 1541. I said he was born in Augsburg and then moved to Basel in 1515. He moved there when he was just 18, and he was apprenticed to Basel's leading painter, Hans Herbster. And these are his earliest portraits, commissioned by Jacob Mayer Zumhausen, Mayor of Basel, showing him and his second wife, Dorothea Kannengeiser. And we believe the occasion for the portrait could be because Mayor van Hausen was elected as mayor the same year this was painted, 1516. Holbein became a member of the Painters' Guild in Basel in 1519, and within a few years of that, he was becoming known and sought after across Europe, particularly for his portraits, although at this time, the early 1520s, his fame was still growing. At this time, in Basel, he was well known for his religious paintings as well as his portraits, and this is perhaps his best known and most unusual religious work, the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. It was commissioned by Bonifacius Amerbach, who was a well-known scholar and humanist, in fact a friend of Erasmus. We don't know exactly why it was commissioned or where it would have been placed in a church, but it was recorded as part of Amerbach's art collection. We know that his father, Holbein's father, had taken him to see Matthias Grunwald's altarpiece in Isenheim, which is a crucifixion, but the predella, or underneath, shows a prone figure of the dead Christ, similar to this work. Now, such works were intended to evoke feelings of guilt and empathy in the viewer. Holbein's version is notable for its dimensions and also the wounds. This is a close-up which shows realistic dead flesh and even the early stages of putrefaction. His eyes and mouth are shown open. We don't know why, but perhaps it's symbolic to indicate that even in death, Christ is all-seeing and his spoken word remains. A few years later, Holbein produced a series of 41 woodcuts called The Dance of Death. These show how all ranks and classes of society must die, from the ploughman to the abbot and the emperor. The message is, death comes for us all. These are in fact a type of drawing or woodcut. The Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre, was a well-known medieval theme. It dated back to around 1425. Holbein's taken an original approach because his figures are not actually dancing, but are shown being taken by death in a more realistic setting. Here, for example, we see a young noblewoman being escorted as part of a normal daily activity when death appears in front of her, signifying her sudden death. One of his early works was this portrait of the humanist philosopher Desiderius Erasmus, known throughout Europe for his learning, and his support for Holbein helped spread Holbein's fame across Europe. And as you can see, this is a typical Holbein portrait known for its precision, economy of line, penetration of character and richness of style. Although despite his fame, we'll see later, he unusually didn't found any school of painting. He did travel around. For example, between 1517 and 1519, he moved to Lucerne to complete a project with his father. He returned to Basel in 1519, set up a busy workshop, married Elsbeth Schmidt, who was an older widow who already had a son, and together they had a son, Philip, in the first year of their marriage. Now it was about this time that Lutheranism arrived in Basel. And remember, Holbein was producing religious paintings, cartoons for stained glass, woodcuts for books, but the Protestant iconoclasm, that is the destruction of religious art, was spreading. So in 1526 he travelled to England looking for work. He had a recommendation from Erasmus and was welcomed by a friend of Erasmus, Thomas More, the famous humanist. Incidentally, the book Erasmus is holding here refers to Herculean labours, which is a reference to his translation of the New Testament. And behind him, it can't easily be read, but behind him the book on the shelf has a punning reference to Holbein's skill. It reads, translated, quote, "I am Johannes Holbein, whom it is easier to denigrate than to emulate." This is a portrait of More, And this portrait led to other commissions, such as William Wareham, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, Nicholas Kratzer, the Bavarian astronomer and mathematician, the person who in fact designed the clock at Hampton Court. And although he didn't work for the king, Henry VIII, he did work for his courtiers. And we'll see a portrait of Sir Henry Guilford and his wife, Lady Mary, and Anne Lovell, the woman in Lady with a Squirrel and a Starling. He returned to Basel, probably to retain his citizenship and his membership of the Painters Guild. And because of the commissions he'd received in England, he was able to afford to buy 2 houses in Basel. Then he returned to London again, and in 1540, with the downfall of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and most seriously Thomas Cromwell, he was left without a major sponsor, and so he completed minor commissions until his death, age 45, in 1543. Let's look at this painting in a bit more detail. What I've shown here is a detail, the head of Thomas More from the paintings. And what I'm going to do is to slowly fade it away to the drawing he made. So you'll see the drawing, which I've enlarged, appearing beneath the painting. The drawing is the study for the painting, and the painting we just saw is now in the Frick collection in New York. And this drawing in black and coloured chalks is in the Royal Collection in London. You'll notice how Holbein's intense and vivid portraits depend on the precise placement of nose, eyes and mouth, and he often slightly adjusted them when painting to convey a feeling, I think, of movement and the presence of an individual. Notice, by the way, that the drawing has been pricked to enable it to be transferred to a canvas. And also the inscription, upper left, Thomas More, Lord Chancellor, was added later in the 18th century. Now, the paintings and drawings relate to a group portrait of Thomas More's family, and there are, I won't go through them all, there are 6 more drawings by Holbein in preparation for this group portrait, which are now in the Royal Collection. For example, Thomas More's father, his son John More, and his wife Anne Cressacre, and his daughters. This is an original sketch annotated by the astronomer Nicholas Kratzer, who was a friend of Holbein and More, and it was presented to Erasmus. He added the names and ages of the sitters in Latin. Just to run through them quickly, on the left is Elizabeth Dauncey, More's second daughter. Beside her, his adopted daughter, Margaret Giggs. She's explaining a point to Thomas More's father, John More. And then Thomas More is sitting in the centre with the engaged couple either side of him, Anne Cressacre and his only son, John More. Then beside John More is the household fool, Henry Pattinson. And on the right of the picture, More's youngest daughter, Cecily Heron, his eldest daughter, Margaret Roper, and More's second wife, Alice. She's the one kneeling on the extreme right. Most of them, as you can see, are holding prayer books, signifying this may have been a prayer gathering, or maybe it's just a symbol of the family's religious devotions. And a final point, Notice at the top in the centre there's an ornate clock. Clocks were expensive at this time, and showing a clock shows the family's high standing. The first clocks were invented in the 13th century, but they were large mechanisms typically found in churches, but as time went by they became smaller and smaller and more ornate and complex. This is a copy of the original painting because unfortunately the painting was destroyed by fire in the 18th century. And we know from a letter, Erasmus talks of More's love for animals, and in the painting it's a bit hard to make out, but bottom right there's a pet monkey and you can see the family dogs, although you'll have noticed they're not in the sketch. There's also musical instruments in the background which are not in the sketch. This is one of two near life-size copies of the painting, and it was probably commissioned by More's grandson, Thomas More II, to commemorate 5 generations of the family. Moving on, this is Henry Guilford, painted in or drawn in 1527. We assume that these drawings were done directly from life in preparation for the final painting, and it's very useful because it enables us to see the subtle changes he made to improve his sitter's look or to increase the impact, and it provides an insight into his approach and his style of portraiture. It shows that he wasn't painting what you might call a photographic likeness. It was a carefully controlled construction designed to create a particular impact on the viewer. So Henry Guilford was one of Henry VIII's closest friends, and at different times he held various positions. He was Esquire of the Body, Master of the Revels, Master of the Horse, Comptroller of the Royal Household. And this drawing is a study for a painted portrait of Holbein that I'll show you in a moment. And I'll show you a drawing and painting of his wife, a companion portrait of Lady Mary Guilford, which is now in Basel. Now, as I said, Guilford was one of Henry VIII's closest friends. He was a personal attendant to the king. He became Master of Revels, which was the person responsible for lavish entertainment at court, Morris dancers, moving stages, elaborate costumes and so on. But Guilford's influence at court was cut short because in 1519 there was a purge on what they called minions. It was an attempt by older statesmen to limit the influence of hot-headed young men on the 28-year-old monarch. However, Guilford soon returned to court and had a distinguished career from that point on as comptroller of the royal household. He, however, continued supporting Catherine of Aragon, which made him a dangerous enemy of Anne Boleyn, the king's mistress, later wife, and it's a mark of his friendship with Henry that he remained in his post until his death in 1532. This, in fact, is one of Holbein's most impressive surviving portraits. He's standing 3/4 length, dressed in velvet, fur and cloth of gold. Notice how Holbein is able to convey the exact texture of the various materials and substances used. You can even see running down his arm, you can just about make out the richer black of the velvet on his sleeve of black satin running down the velvet of the sleeve. He used shell gold paint and gold leaf to heighten the picture. and emphasised the luxuriousness of the sitter's dress and his status. Incidentally, the white staff shows his status. It's the staff of the office of the comptroller of the household, and the hat badge you see shows a clock and geometrical instruments. Not in the preparatory drawing, so it could have been that it was a subject that Holbein would have studied separately and drawn separately and then combined in the final painting. There's a curtain rail above, from which a rich green curtain hangs. Now, Guildford was a keen scholar and an experienced courtier, and his interest in humanist studies may have drawn him to Hans Holbein, who arrived in England with a recommendation from Erasmus, and they almost certainly worked together in the planning of revels at Greenwich in 1527, when what was called Master Hans carried out much of the decorative painting. Guildford was in fact one of the first in England to commission a portrait from Holbein. If we compare it with the drawing, we see it's interesting that Holbein has sort of firmed up the face. He's made the eyes slightly more alert, and these changes, subtle changes, increase the solidity, power and authority of the face without changing the, if you like, the accuracy of the depiction of the individual. He's also added clothing that was probably modelled by a servant to minimise the time Guildford spent sitting for the portrait. So Guildford probably just sat briefly for the drawing, and then the rest was a servant wearing the clothes for Holbein to accurately depict. Holbein drew this portrait on his first visit to England. It's a study for his oil portrait of Lady Mary, which was closely based on the drawing we'll see, but is more solemn. And this was the time that he also produced that study of her husband, Sir Henry Guildford. The drawing is slightly larger than the drawing of Sir Henry, which makes us think that the drawing of Sir Henry has been cut down. In fact, Holbein took this drawing back with him to Basel, which is why it's now in the museum there. And that shows us, I think, that indicates that the drawings weren't held in high regard, weren't demanded by the patrons. What they were interested in is the painting. And this shows the painting. You can see the changes that Holbein has made compared to the drawing. The painting is now in the St. Louis Art Museum. She's placed by a pillar, and you can see a continuation of the rail that we just saw in her husband portrait, the rail with the green curtain. So it sort of unites the two works, which makes us believe that originally they were hung together. The painting, incidentally, was originally thought to be a copy. And there is a copy, a 16th century copy, which was long thought to be the original. And that copy is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And research has now shown that this painting in the St. Louis Art Museum was in fact the original. And she's shown here embodying worldly prosperity. She holds a prayer book in her hands, the very image of propriety. The character in the drawing, however, shows a more winsome charmer glancing off to the side. So Holbein has changed the direction of the sitter's gaze to suggest a more mature and proper woman. The ivy, by the way, may have intended as a symbol of steadfastness. And he also, as you can see, has made her face slightly thinner and the mouth slightly smaller to because these would be recognised as the elements of beauty at the time. This is a lady with a squirrel and a starling in the National Gallery. We now believe it's been plausibly identified as Anne Lovell, the wife of Sir Francis Lovell, who was one of Henry VIII's retinue. Squirrels, in fact, appear on the Lovell coat of arms, which explains the squirrel, although the squirrel was added at a later date. The starling may be a punning reference to the family seat at East Harling in Norfolk. It's unlikely to have formed a pair with her husband, as she's facing right and a woman conventionally looks to the left when their portraits are hung together. However, there are exceptions. For example, there's a portrait of Sir Thomas and Lady Aylott, and it's possible that this was one of a pair of paintings. Now, in 1528, Holbein returned to Basel, which is where his wife and child had remained, because, as I said, there was a rule: if an artist spent more than 2 years away, they would lose their citizenship and membership of the Painters Guild. However, religious reform was moving at a pace. Iconoclasm meant that there was a drop in demand for religious paintings, and England was also undergoing significant political and religious changes. So Holbein saw an opportunity to find new patrons within the changing social circles in England. And if he returned, he believed, because of his fame by this stage, he could join Henry VIII's court and become commissioned by the Boleyn family. Now, Thomas Cromwell, shown here, was a statesman whose power rose, and he became the right-hand man of Cardinal Wolsey. It was he that suggested that Henry VIII that he make himself head of the Church of England to facilitate his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. In this, this is actually, notice it says after Hans Holbein the Younger. So in this copy after an original by Holbein, Cromwell is dressed soberly in black, with in a simple setting: wood panels, damask wall covering, Turkish carpet. They show his interest in fine things. On the table there's a book, probably devotional, a quill, scissors to trim it, a soft leather bag which would have held his seal. The writing on the paper makes his position clear. It says, "To Master Thomas Cromwell, trusty and right well beloved master of our jewel house." This was one of the positions that Cromwell held prior to becoming Henry's chief minister. Although, of course, eventually there was his downfall and he was executed for treason in 1540. This is an early portrait of the Speaker of the House of Commons, Richard Rich, later 1st Baron Rich. He was later to become Lord Chancellor during the reign of Edward VI, and during the reign of Mary he was the persecutor and torturer of Protestants. He gave evidence against Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher before their executions in 1535, and also against Thomas Cromwell, who, as I said, was executed in 1540. He tortured and burned many minor evangelists, including personally torturing Anne Askew, the only woman to be tortured in the Tower in its 1,000-year history. Since the mid-16th century, Rich has had a highly negative reputation for immorality, financial dishonesty, double-dealing, perjury and treachery. There isn't anyone, it's hard to find anyone like him that can be matched in all of English history. The historian Hugh Trevor Roper dismissed Rich as a man, quote, of whom nobody has ever spoken a good word. Which brings us on to the portraits of Henry VIII. There are about 13 pictures of Henry VIII from this period, but only 3 are known to be by Holbein. Some of the others may be, but most are copies of the Holbein portraits. Perhaps the most important is this one, the Whitehall mural, but it was destroyed in a fire in 1698, a fire started by a laundry maid who left washing to dry for too long in front of an open fire. So how do we have this? Well, it's a painting, it's a copy by Remigius van Liemput, painted in 1667, just before the 1698 fire. So how did it originate? In 1537, Henry VIII commissioned Holbein to create a mural of the Tudor dynasty to commemorate the birth of his son and heir Edward. And it was the only mural which Holbein painted in England. And it originally occupied an entire wall in Whitehall. Whitehall had been designated as the official residence of the monarch just a year earlier. And Charles II had already commissioned this small copy 30 years previously from the Flemish artist Van Liemput. Notice we do have the cartoon, the sketch he made, which was transferred to the mural. Between the sketch and the final mural, you can see Holbein has changed Henry's posture so that he looks now in the mural directly out at us, and he's more dominating, an imposing figure who dwarfs his father, Henry VII, who's standing behind him. The pedestal has a long inscription. I won't read it all. It's in Latin, but translated, part of it reads, "The Son," that is Henry VII's son, "born indeed for greater things, remove the unworthy from their altars and replace them by upright men." So what Henry VIII is saying here is that he was greater than his father, and that he has replaced the people running the church by more worthy, honest and upright men. Gives you an understanding of the separation from the Roman church. It was because Henry remained, in his mind, he remained a Catholic, but he'd felt that the Pope had become corrupt, and that it was his duty to take over the church as an upright, honest and honourable man. That was, as I said, his belief. Incidentally, the 2 women on the other side of the pedestal are Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, and the mother of his son, and standing in front of her is Henry VII's wife and Henry VIII's mother, Elizabeth of York. This is the first and very significant portrait of Henry, now in the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection in Madrid. It's the only portrait where Holbein uses lapis lazuli for the blue. For the other pictures, he used azurite, which often turns a sort of sludgy grey-brown colour over the centuries. Although some portraits he painted, it hasn't turned. It remains blue. We think it's because of the composition of the azurite and also the thickness of the varnish prevents oxidation. The gold is powdered gold ground with oil. And one suggestion is that Henry had this painted by Holbein as an exchange of gifts with the King of France. Note, by the way, that Henry did not send out pictures of himself to prospective brides, and he even refused to send portraits of his daughter Mary to foreigners when she was looking for a husband. This was probably painted around 1536, about the time of Anne Boleyn's execution and in the middle of the dissolution of the monasteries and just before Henry's son was born. You could see, it's interesting that Holbein, I think in the expression, it's tinged with a hint of cruelty. Henry's looking guarded, and we know from other accounts that his exuberant youthful energy was starting to turn at this stage into suspicions of old age. There is incidentally another version of this portrait, probably painted by another artist in the National Portrait Gallery. And then the third work I mentioned by Holbein, although it's now believed by a workshop of Holbein, it's not clear how much of this was painted by Holbein, if any. It was commissioned by the Company of Barbers and the Guild of Surgeons when they merged in 1540. And we assume that Henry was not involved. He didn't sit for this portrait. And Henry is shown here not so much as a living person, but as a sort of icon. But the members of the company were painted as individuals. The figures, for example, of Sir William Butts and the Dr. John Chambers are very close to portraits of them that were painted by Holbein. It's probably best viewed as a Holbein-influenced ceremonial work, probably produced by his workshop shortly before his death, and possibly completed after his death. There is a cartoon for the composition, later much painted over by other hands, which reveals his original conception. And this painting departs from that in places. The second row of figures, for example, on the right, were added in the mid-16th century by, we don't know who, an anonymous painter. Because of all these different hands that were involved, Holbein's biographer, Derek Wilson, describes this painting as a disaster. A lifeless, oversized king dangles the charter from a limp hand, while a row, the second rank was added later, of comparatively diminutive recipients kneel in relevant homage. The treatment is archaic and atypical, end quote. So it's I show it to you as there are so few portraits of Henry VIII by Holbein. This is Sir Richard Southwell, a controversial figure, and Holbein's portrait has been taken perhaps unfairly as evidence that Southwell was a haughty and indecisive character. But whatever his attributes, the drawing remains one of Holbein's most impressive and careful records of the appearance of a member of Henry VIII's court. Note, for example, you can't read it, but note on the right, Holbein wrote, Die Augen ein wenig gelbat, the eyes a little yellowish, just showing his attention to detail, making a note to himself for when he produced the painting. Now, Southwell was someone who was careful to ally himself with rising stars and to desert them as they fell, like Richard Rich. He failed to speak up in defence of Sir Thomas More, despite knowing that evidence against the ex-Chancellor was falsified, and his testimony was responsible for the downfall of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, whose portrait we'll see later. He was executed for treason in 1547. So, thanks to all this deft politicking, Southwell largely retained his influence through the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I. This is the portrait of Southwell, now in the Uffizi. And by enlarging the face and comparing it with the enlarged drawing, we see that Holbein has made Southwell look slightly less boyish, I think. He's deepened the eye sockets, added more stubble, and he's accentuated the philtrum. That's the part of the face between the nose and the mouth, and made the chin slightly stronger, I think. So with these subtle additions, he's retained what is undoubtedly an accurate portrait, but has added to the stature of the person that he's portraying. This is Queen Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, mother of Edward VI. It's a half-length portrait facing 3/4 to the left. There's a horizontal join in the paper at on the lower margins. It was a preparatory study used by Holbein for a number of portraits of Jane Seymour, including a painting I'm just about to show you in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. The title was added much later in the 18th century at the upper left. This is the portrait of Jane Seymour, and let me show you inside the drawing alongside it so that you can compare them fairly close. The figure's been frozen in sort of an official sense of responsibility. The simplicity of the shadowed background, I think, accentuates the richness and boldness of the design, and the adornment in the fashions of Henry's court. The artist's skill is preeminent in creating the sheen and lustre of the costume, the velvet, the precious stones, and great attention's been paid to the realism of the silver thread in the Queen's dress. (1539), this is a portrait of Anne of Cleves. So in 1537, Henry VIII's wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to a son, but she died 2 weeks later of complications, and Henry needed a second son, and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw Anne of Cleves as strengthening the nation's position by forming an alliance with a small but respected state in what is now Germany. Henry was concerned about her physical appearance, so he sent his leading portrait painter, the court painter Holbein, to capture a likeness, and this is the resulting portrait now in the Louvre. Henry was impressed by what he saw, and the marriage contract was signed within a few weeks before he'd actually seen Anne in person. When she arrived in England, Henry decided to dress in disguise to surprise her. This was a well-known convention of courtly love. The lady was meant to recognise her suitor and instantly fall in love. But Anne was ill-advised She didn't recognise the king. No one explained what was going on to her beforehand, and even, according to some accounts, pushed him aside as she walked across the room. Henry immediately decided he didn't want to marry her, but his ministers couldn't get out of the contract, and so they were married at Greenwich Palace in 1540. He told Cromwell, "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." And in fact, they were unable to have sexual intercourse on the night of their marriage to legalise the union, and as a result, the marriage was annulled as it was unconsummated. Now, interestingly, no one at the time blamed Holbein as misrepresenting her appearance. It seems that it was an accurate representation of what she looked like, but it was a clash of cultures. She wasn't brought up in the music, the dancing of Henry's court, and also it seems there was no sexual chemistry. Now, Anne was understandably frightened for her life, but she remained composed, and in gratitude Henry awarded her a very generous settlement castle, and in addition he gave her an income of £500 a year. And Thomas Cromwell, who had recommended Anne of Cleves, was executed 19 days after the marriage was annulled, not solely because of the misarranged marriage. You might wonder what happened to Anne of Cleves. The French ambassador wrote, "She has a more joyous countenance than ever. She wears a great variety of dresses and passes all her time in sports and recreations." End quote. So no need to worry about Anne. She had a very happy life from that point onwards. This is Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, Earl Marshal, which was the most senior earl in the most senior aristocratic position in the country. He was a prominent Tudor politician. He was the uncle of two of the wives of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and played a major role in the machinations behind the marriages. But he fell from favour in 1546, stripped of his dukedom, imprisoned in the Tower, and avoided execution when the king unexpectedly died on the 28th of January, the morning of the day that Thomas Howard was due to be executed. Now, I'll just show you one piece. I did say at the beginning that Holbein was a master designer of precious metalwork, silver and gold. Unfortunately, none of his over 250 designs of these objects survive today. But this is one of his last works, produced by Anthony Denny, who was one of Henry VIII's closest and most trusted friends and a member of the Privy Council. And in fact, Denny had this designed in order to, it's a clock salt that he gave to Henry VIII as a New Year's gift in 1544, 2 months after Holbein had died. And in fact, there was 2 notes in the hand of Nicholas Kratzer indicating that they collaborated on the design. It's a very complex instrument you see here. There's an hourglass, 2 sundials, a clock, a compass shown on the left, and a salt dispenser. We know it would have been very appealing to Henry VIII as he had a passion for clocks. We now come to perhaps Holbein's best known work in the National Gallery, The Ambassadors. It's a very unusual painting in many ways and has been the subject of much discussion, scholarly interest and interpretation. Now Holbein, as we've seen, usually paints half-length portraits, and he doesn't usually include such a wealth of potentially symbolic meaning. It's been suggested that the two shelves of instruments and globes represent their wealth. However, the wealthy would typically stack gold and silver plate to demonstrate their wealth. Although the instruments are expensive, they're not equivalent to gold plate. It could represent the wealth of their knowledge. If you carefully examine the instruments, there are many discrepancies that could be mistakes or can be and have been interpreted as a meaning. Holbein meticulously painted each item, and therefore he planned and decided on their orientation and configuration, so it's unlikely they are simply mistakes because of the trouble he went to paint them. However, the meaning is now lost, but John North, professor of the history of science and an expert on medieval scientific instruments, has analysed them and suggested a solution, which I include some information from his book, The Ambassador's Secret, which I recommend. It's a book that interprets a possible meaning of each of these instruments. We've got to remember, of course, that this was a time of a belief in witchcraft, astrology, magical charms, and demonical possession. And this is all supported by extensive literature that relates it to theology and metaphysical philosophy, all supported by classical references. So although I call them scientific instruments, there wasn't any conception at the time of what we understand by the scientific method. It's also been suggested that the floor is a copy of the Cosmati pavement in the area in front of the high altar at Westminster Abbey, but it's not an accurate copy. It may be just a generalised Cosmati floor. The Cosmati were a Roman family who specialised in such mosaic floors, especially for churches. Let's start by looking at these various components, but I'll begin by looking at the two individuals shown, and then I'll come back and go through each of these component parts of the painting and try to tie them, or to take John North's interpretation of how they can all be tied together. So starting with the individuals, the figure we now believe on the left is Jean de Damville, Seigneur of Policy, French ambassador to the court of Henry VIII for most of 1533. We actually can see that his seat at Policy is one of only 4 places marked on the globe. We'll see later. The man on the right has been identified as Georges de Selve, Bishop of Lavaur, and according to art historian John Rowlands, de Selve is not wearing his episcopal robes because he wasn't consecrated until the following year, 1534. And we know de Selve from his letters that he visited London in the spring of 1533. A very important date, as we'll see. Now, at the top left of the painting, let me just go back quickly and show you. Here is a small crucifix, often unnoticed. The green curtain has been associated with the tearing of the temple curtain in the crucifixion story called the Green Language, also called the language of birds. It's a medieval, mystical, divine language which was believed to be the key to perfect knowledge. It could also symbolise the division between the earthly and heavenly realms, as represented in churches and often used in tombs. The anamorphic skull at the bottom jars with the detailed and accurate representation in the rest of the painting. So we believe that Holbein is making a statement, but unfortunately it's not clear what the statement is. It's been there was one suggestion, which I don't believe, that it's a play on the German words holles Bein, hollow bone, a play on Holbein's name. So, but it's unlikely that so large and intrusive an element in a work that was commissioned by Jean de Danneville and Georges de Selve, who we can assume paid for the work, they wouldn't have found it acceptable, such a large element representing Holbein. As the skull can be seen accurately like this, only from high up on the right side or very low down on the left, it's been suggested it was designed to be hung in a stairwell, so someone walking up or down the stairs would be startled by the sudden appearance of the skull. The white quadrant shows the same time as the cylindrical sundial. The left universal equinoctial dial, which has been disassembled, was invented and common throughout Europe. It's a formal sundial used to tell the time. The polyhedral sundial can be mounted high up and read when viewed horizontally like a normal sundial. It's a puzzle, as it seems to show a different time on different faces, and it's set to the latitude of North Africa, not London. Perhaps a reference to Golgotha, Jerusalem. At the back is what's called a torquetum, which is a form of computer used to convert measurements made in 3 sets of coordinates, thought to have been invented in the 12th or 13th century. But the oldest surviving example we have is from the 16th century, and interestingly it's set to the latitude of London, 51.5 degrees. And the edge of the book records the age of Georges de Selve, and the date represented by all these devices is Good Friday, the 11th of April, 1533, when the angle of the sun above the horizon was 27 degrees at a few minutes past 4 in the afternoon. And this angle of 27 degrees occurs many times in the painting. It's in fact the precise angle that you need to view the anamorphic skull to see it as a skull. It's the angle of the sun just after 4 on Good Friday 1533, and 27, this angle, is thrice the 3 of the Trinity. 3 times 3 times 3. This is a handheld terrestrial globe. Danneville's estate is marked the town of Policy. Rome is painted roughly in the centre of the globe, and the coast of America is shown in the far edge. The book is a book of arithmetic by Peter Appian. It's been identified. It's propped open with a set square. It was written in 1527. It could be a reference to de Selve's family background as merchants, and it's opened on page has 3 long divisions, which could symbolise the division of the church, which we know de Selve was concerned about. I've turned the book upside down so it's a bit easier to see the 3 long divisions in the book. This is an 11-string lute, but you can see one of the strings is broken. There's a pair of dividers in the background, a Lutheran hymnal, and a case of flutes. Now, music is one of the four disciplines of the quadrivium, the four arts taught in medieval universities, which also included arithmetic, geometry and astronomy, which are shown symbolically in the painting. The broken string of the lute and the missing flute may signify discord in the church. The Lutheran hymnal, we know, is the second edition of Johannes Walter's Little Hymn Book of 1525. It's open at two of Martin Luther's own hymns in German, which can be translated as "Come Holy Ghost, God and Lord," and the other, "Man, if thou wouldst live a good life and remain with God eternally." And it was noticed a long time ago that the two hymns don't actually occur next to each other in the book. The second hymn is numbered 19, which was the number of Easter, as it's the date for Easter repeats in a 19-year cycle. And the line through the hymnal passes through the number 19. So why would a Catholic show Luther's hymns? The broken string might indicate the reason. De Selve in later life thought he could reconcile the Roman Catholic and Protestant elements of the church, and the broken string might represent the lack of harmony of Luther's teaching, which, if correctly interpreted, De Selve thought he could bring them back into the Catholic fold. The celestial globe shows the constellations. Most obvious is Cygnus the Swan. It's shown as a cock-like bird labelled Galatia, perhaps symbolising France. Cygnus is also traditionally associated with the cross of Christ, as its stars form a Latin cross. The globe is supported by ram's heads, and on April the 11th, 1533, the sun entered the sign of Taurus, and the constellation of Aries, the ram, was mostly in Taurus. And Jesus Christ is often referred to as a ram, and Christ as the Lamb of God is often shown with horns, that is, as a ram. The globe is remarkably accurately painted, and John North believes the ring is set to the latitude of London, although some people disagree and think it's set for Rome. The cylindrical sundial, bottom right, is set for London, shows the time of 8:15 a.m. or 3:45 p.m, Good Friday, 11th of April, 1533. So why have I been talking so significantly about 1533, apart from the fact it was when both of the participants in the portrait were in London? It's because it was exactly 1500 years after the crucifixion, and North has interpreted this 3:45 p.m. Good Friday, 11th of April 1533 as exactly 1500 years after the crucifixion and Christ's death. The skull partly obscures a hexagram on the floor, and John North posits other hexagrams in the painting. The hexagram is a Star of David and Seal of Solomon, which was a signet ring that enabled Solomon to speak to animals and command demons. And it's been argued the two levels of instrument symbolise the quadrivium of the four sciences. We see astronomy, geometry, arithmetic and music. So John North starts to place lines across the painting, which puts us in dangerous territory, because it's possible to draw lines across many paintings to support almost any theory you like. However, I have drawn two key lines which I think are of interest. The upper line passes through the left eye of Christ on the cross, the left eye of D'Andeville, the star Vega in Lyra, the star Deneb in Cygnus, the north point of the horizon, the sun on the globe, and the 0 point of the quadrant, and it crosses the lower line through the skull. At the exact point, the skull must be viewed to see it in its true perspective. The diagonal and the two squares was the way that horoscopes were presented at this time. In other words, there's a hidden horoscope square which North presents like this. And this is a typical horoscope, the way they were drawn at the time. This is a horoscope for Jesus, published by the Italian mathematician and inventor Girolamo Cardano in 1554. I should perhaps add that because it's exactly 1500 years later, many believed before Good Friday of 1533 that it was going to be the last judgment day, the end of the world. So there's many interpretations. It could simply be a double portrait of two friends showing their interests. It could be a double portrait with a lot of things to remind us of death and our own mortality. In other words, a portrait combined with a memento mori. It could be a symbolic representation of the division and disharmony in the church at the time and the centrality of Rome. Or it could be a reminder of the sacrifice of Christ at Easter, and that Good Friday 1533 was exactly 1500 years after the crucifixion. It's an enigmatic painting. There's been many interpretations. Most art historians avoid assigning complex meanings to paintings, as we've lost most of the context. There's also a deeper point. A masterpiece often holds many contradictory meanings in balance, meaning there is no single meaning. Like life, we're presented with possibilities, some more likely than others, and each viewer can find within it the meanings that satisfy them. Which brings me to the last portrait. I finish with this painting, generally regarded as Holbein's last major work, painted a year or two before his death. He died suddenly in 1543, probably from plague. So this painting shows Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. Remember earlier we saw a portrait of Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk. This is his best known son because Henry Howard is one of the founders of English Renaissance poetry. However, he was described at the time as rash and violent to the point of madness, but also he was described as a brilliant and penetrating intellect. But Henry VIII became convinced, or was convinced by others, that the Howards intended to usurp Prince Edward when Henry died. And in fact, as a consequence, this chap, Henry Howard, became the last person to be executed by Henry VIII on the 19th of January 1547, and his father was due to be executed on the 28th of January. But Henry VIII died that morning, and rather than start the new reign of Edward with bloodshed, he was kept in prison for 6 years and eventually pardoned. Which brings us to the end of his life and my talk. His work is remarkable, both for the disparity between his subtle and accurate portraits and the stylized portraits of the later Elizabethan period. It's difficult to trace a successor to Holbein's style. He didn't he had a workshop, but his style and work wasn't continued through the Elizabethan period, although he did remain, his reputation remained high during the Elizabethan period. His work was well known and well regarded, but in the Elizabethan period the style changed for other reasons. In the 17th century, his reputation started to decline as many of his works were misattributed and he was seen as a religious painter. He was rediscovered in the 18th century and was regarded then as a key figure in the English Tudor Renaissance. And in the 19th century, there was a Victorian fascination for the Tudor period, and that led to a dramatic revival in Holbein's status. And from the 20th century onwards, he's been regarded as one of the great masters of European portraiture alongside Titian and Dürer and Velázquez. So that brings me to the end of my talk today. Thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye for now.